Happy New Year. Happy 2025. And God, don't I feel old just saying that? Look, whoever you are, all two of you, whoever you are, wherever you are in the world, whether you do resolutions or you don't, or you do them and you break them, or you do them and you keep them, I wish that the next 365 days will be the greatest days of your life. And so let's bring in the new year with, I guess, a thematically perfect book. It's 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Spanish accent.
I don't know why.
It is a masterpiece. I found it utterly baffling. It's like the totality of human experience condensed into one book. It was that Casey Affleck film, the one with Rooney Mara, and A Ghost Story with Casey Affleck and Rooney Mara, that made me really want to read this book. Let me know down below if you've seen it. Because I read somewhere that Lowry was really inspired by 100 Years of Solitude to create that film, and I love that film. I had no idea what the book was about, like zero. I had heard of magical realism, and I had some kind of idea of what it was. I also knew that Gabriel Garcia Marquez, no accent this time, he won the Nobel Prize in Literature. And also on the cover of my book, there's a quote by Salman Rushdie saying that this is the greatest novel in any language of the past 50 years. All of that to say, by the time I read this book, I really wanted to read this book. And I started reading it at my usual pace. And like all of those magical realism moments, I thought they were kind of cute. And I thought like the conceits of the book, I thought they were kind of quaint, and like the weird naming of people in the book, I was like, oh, that's weird. But I sort of went on with it, and I was just reading it, zip, 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 zip. And then all of a sudden, it just struck me what Gabriel Garcia Marquez was doing. And from that moment on, I started reading very slowly. Welcome to my no spoiler review of 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez.
Like, share, subscribe.
Gabriel José de la Concordia Garcia Marquez. Gabriel José de la Concordia Garcia Marquez. Spanish again, for some reason. 1927 to 2014, he began as a journalist, an acclaimed writer of non-fiction and short stories, and then the story goes that while driving with his family on the way to Acapulco, the missing piece to a story idea that he'd been harboring since he was 18, so that's around 40 years, suddenly slipped into place, and he turned his car around to drive home to begin writing immediately. He sold his car to feed his family to survive. He entrusted his wife, Mercedes Baracha, to manage his household finances, and he wrote for 18 months solid. There are videos of him on YouTube telling that story, but in more detail. And he also tells other stories too. As you can imagine, he's a great storyteller. And these videos are well worth a watch because you really do get a feel of who Gabriel Garcia Marquez was as a person. And also his wife too, because she really was the linchpin for him writing these incredible novels, you know, like Love in the Time of Cholera. And that's the only one I can think of right now. 100 Years of Solitude was published in 1967, and it's a multi-generational story of the Buendia family, and it's all set in this fictional town called Macondo. And so on that scale, on the scale of Macondo, it charts the cultural dynamics, and there's like social movements, there's civil wars. And it very deliberately mirrors the history of Colombia and the United Fruit Company's impact on that country. And more broadly speaking, it reflects the Latin American experience, the Latin American history told by a Latin American person with all of its political and historical complexities. It really paints that big picture by like really nailing the things that happen on a smaller scale, on the individual scale. People are the way they are because of how they were brought up, because of their environment. People are the way they are because of who their parents were, how their parents brought them up, how their parents were brought up. 100 Years of Solitude really nails how different personalities and different behaviors and different ways we see the world kind of arise from those different circumstances. And we can see how it affects the next generation and the next generation. And sometimes we can see how those individuals shape their history, change the circumstances in which they live. And I thought it was so amazing how psychologically on point Gabriel Garcia Marquez was. Because ultimately, the thesis of the book is that history just repeats itself. It's always the same thing over and over and over again, whether we're talking about generational trauma or certain behaviors that just run in the family, or whether it's financial cycles or like booms and busts, cultural explosions, immigration patterns. He nails it all through the psychology of the individual. And it's all there through the story of the Macondo family, making the same mistakes over and over and over again across generations. The final line of the book, and this is not a spoiler, so there's a character that's deciphering some parchments. The final line of the book is, everything written on them, the parchments, was unrepeatable since time immemorial and forevermore, because races condemned to 100 years of solitude did not have a second opportunity on Earth. Which, frankly, I just don't understand. Let me know down below if you actually understand it. But it somehow makes sense. Like, I think it touches on the unknowability of experience, of our experiences, like how there is no way anyone can know what the actual lived experience of somebody else is, despite us making the same mistakes over and over and over again. No matter how hard we try and how intermingled our lives are, our experiences will only ever be our experiences. Unrepeatable, yet repeated over generations in different forms. It's the grand irony of life. I actually mentioned this grand irony of life thing, or something similar, in one of my previous videos, The Unbearable Lightness of Being by Milan Kundera, no spoiler review. The link's down below. I borrowed this book from a friend 4 years ago, and I completely forgot that I borrowed it from him. It was literally until after I finished the book, he sent me a message saying, hey, do you still have my copy? And that's when I realized. But in those 4 years, I had read the opening lines to this book over and over and over again. There was something magical to the words. I had no idea that they were some of the best known lines in world literature. Yeah, you're getting the opening lines too at this point. I might as well just read the whole book. But this is Gregory Rabasa's definitive translation. Many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Aureliano Buendia was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. The tenses in that sentence, it's crazy. It's written now. Let's just say it's written now, okay? And it's talking about the future, many years later. And many years later, the colonel, when he's facing the firing squad, he was to remember. And it's written like what he is yet to do, like what he hasn't done yet, but what he is yet to do is already predetermined. And what is that already predetermined thing that he is going to do between now, when it's written, and many years later, when he's facing the firing squad? He's discovering ice. What's with that word discover? You see what I mean? Isn't that incredible? Actually, John Green, man, I love John Green. He has an incredible video where he's crash coursing it. I'll put a link to it down below. I'll also put a link to my no spoiler review of his Looking for Alaska down below. But also, doesn't that line have a feeling of nostalgia to it? but it's a feeling of nostalgia for something that hasn't happened yet. Reading it, I don't know what's going to happen. Of course, it's the opening line to a book, right? And if it's your first time, you have no idea what's going to happen, yet there's this feeling of nostalgia for something that hasn't happened. It's like deja vu. It's like history repeating itself. There's a sense of, haven't we been here before? The spirit of the book, what Gabriel Garcia Marquez refers to in his final sentences of 100 Years of Solitude, is already summed up in his first sentence. That's the real magical realism of this book. It's not some girl who speaks in butterflies or some guy who has a magic carpet. It really is one hell of a book. And man, I really don't know what I can say about it. What I can say and what I want to say about my experience of reading 100 Years of Solitude, it's unrepeatable forever. I could spend 100 years in solitude trying to craft what my experience of reading it was like. But ultimately, my experience of reading Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, it won't get a second chance.
Like, share, and subscribe.